In 1926, H.W. Fowler, the legendary English lexicographer and philologist, writing in his authoritative modern English usage, complained vociferously that proposition was a jack-of-all-trades word that had come to be used in so many different ways that it really had no meaning. Disdainfully noting that misuse of this term had apparently spread from America to England, Fowler thundered, quote, "It won its popularity partly because it combined the charms of novelty and length. There is less trouble in using it than in choosing a more suitable word from the dozen or so whose places it is apt to usurp," end quote. What so bothered Fowler was that this term, so clearly tied to propounding or setting forth an idea in philosophy, had come to be used to refer to commercial proposals, tasks, jobs, problems, occupations, trade, opponent, prospect, enterprise worth undertaking, area, field, and most galling of all, when used as a verb, to make a, quote, amatory advance. I mention Fowler's diatribe simply to give some context to the way I will use this term when talking about sentences. In the study of logic, a proposition is a statement in which the subject is affirmed or denied by the predicate. In the first lecture, I suggested that for my purposes, a proposition, which is usually expressed in the form of a sentence, is a statement about reality that can be accepted or rejected. Insofar as possible, I like to think of a proposition as a kind of basic or elementary statement that can't easily be broken down into constituent propositions. I live is thus a proposition, but I am tired and hungry actually expresses two basic propositions. I am tired and I am hungry. Moreover, in rigorous logical or philosophical terms, each of those propositions can actually be broken down further into propositions that there's something called an I, that I am in the category of those somethings, that there's a category of physical or emotional condition known as being tired, that my physical or emotional condition falls into that category, and so on. But this kind of rigor will make us crazy and doesn't help us to write better sentences. So I generally won't push things past identifying the propositions directly indicated by visible words in a sentence. So I'll call I am tired a proposition, I am hungry a proposition, and say that the sentence I am tired and hungry expresses two propositions. And these two propositions can be expressed or advanced a number of different ways. I might say, I, who am tired, am also hungry, or I, being tired, am also hungry, or might boil the two propositions down to single-word modifiers that let me start a sentence with tired and hungry, and then take it from there. Tired and hungry, just back from a week in the bush, I limped into the mess hall, hoping the food lines were still open. Now that's a sentence that advances a bunch of propositions, and one I think is a big improvement on just saying I'm tired and hungry. Much more on this later. Now Fowler probably wouldn't approve of the way I'm using the term proposition, but Noam Chomsky probably would. In 1966, Chomsky famously made a 17th century discussion of propositions by the Port Royal grammarians one of the central arguments for his theory of deep structure and transformational grammar. Chomsky's Cartesian Linguistics, a chapter in the history of rationalist thought, claimed that the loose association of 17th century French scholars, known as the Port Royal logicians or grammarians, had developed the framework for his discussion of language formation in terms of deep and surface structure, and the transformative steps that lead from the former to the latter. Chomsky's claims in Cartesian linguistics were immediately challenged, and his linguistic theories remain a site of controversy. For my purposes, however, those controversies are beside the point, since my concern is not with linguistic theories about the formation of language, a process that seems to take place largely at the unconscious level, but with theories of composition that focus on conscious decisions we make when we write sentences. For my purposes, what matters in Chomsky's discussion is the example of the relation between a sentence and its underlying propositions, as he cites from the Port Royal grammar, published in 1660. The sentence Chomsky cites is, Dieu invisible a créé le monde visible. My forays into French are always an adventure, as you can tell, but this sentence in English is, Invisible God created the visible world. The Port Royal Grammar noted that this sentence actually advanced not just one, but three different propositions. That God is invisible, that God created the world, and that the world is visible, with the second proposition, that God created the world, being the most important. As Chomsky summed up his argument, quote, in other words, the deep structure underlying the proposition, invisible God created the visible world, consists of three abstract propositions, each expressing a certain simple judgment, although its surface form expresses only the subject attribute structure, end of quote. Or as he puts it another way, there exists a deep structure, an unwritten or unspoken underlying mental reality, the unwritten propositions, below the surface structure of the spoken or written form of the sentence. He concludes that, quote, the deep structure consists of a system of propositions, and it does not receive a direct point-by-point expression in the actual physical object, the sentence, that is produced. As I noted before, I'm borrowing Chomsky's example and applying it to the conscious choices we make in writing sentences, and I'm neither endorsing nor challenging his theories of transformational grammar. His concerns are quite different from mine. The key here is to think of a sentence as being a visible piece of writing, and the propositions it advances as assumptions and ideas not necessarily visible or written out. As I've previously suggested, the easiest way of thinking about this relationship is to say that a written sentence usually rests on or contains a number of underlying propositions, most of which the sentence simply assumes and which would be too basic or simple sounding to actually write out. As I've noted before, I like to think of the written sentence as the part of the iceberg you see above the water, while many of its underlying propositions remain out of sight underwater. The point here is simply that the basic unit of writing sentences is the proposition, not the word or even a sequence of words. And we build sentences by putting propositions together. The style of our sentences is determined by the ways in which we combine not words, but the propositions those words stand for or refer to. Sentences convey information, organizing it into propositions or statements and then combining those propositions through syntactical arrangements that establish the logical relationships between and among them. Thus, sentences join together propositions, sometimes just coordinating them by putting them side by side. I like to read and I like to write. Sometimes by subordinating one to another. I, who like to write, also like to read. And sometimes marking temporal or causal relationships. Because I like to write, I like to read. Or after I enjoy reading something, I like to start writing. Let's return to that sentence from the Port Royal Grammar. Invisible God created the visible world. Chomsky, like the authors of the Port Royal Grammar, argued that this sentence actually puts forward three propositions, that God is invisible, that God created the world, and that the world is visible. But let's look a bit more closely at the underlying propositions neither Chomsky nor the Port Royal grammarians thought deserving of mention. First, that God exists, there is a God, and that the world exists, there is a world. Now certainly, that first proposition remains a subject of some debate today, and at least among some philosophies, the proposition that the world exists also remains an active question. And underlying the notion that God created the world is the proposition that God is powerful enough to have done so. Okay, I'm stretching a point. But what I hope you'll see is that the sentence, invisible God created the visible world, actually rests upon a number of unstated, unwritten propositions. Moreover, those propositions might have been implied or acknowledged by writing this sentence in a number of different ways. For instance, the sentence might have been written, God is invisible and the world is visible, and God created the world. Or, God is invisible and God created the world, and the world is visible. Or God, who is invisible, created the world which is visible. Or God, being invisible, created the world, it being visible. Or being invisible, God created the world which is visible. Or we could have shifted the focus of the sentence from God to the world. The world is visible, and it was created by God, and God is invisible. The world is visible, and God is invisible, and the world was created by God. The visible world was created by invisible God. The world, which is visible, was created by God, who is invisible. Or, being visible, the world was created by invisible God. And so on. Or even more of the underlying propositions might have been brought to the surface of the sentence. For instance, there is a God, and God is invisible, and God created the world. There is a world, and the world is visible, and there is a God, and God is invisible, and God created the world. Or, there is a God who is invisible, and God created the world which is visible. Or, there is a God who is invisible, and there is a world which is visible, and God created the world. Or, there is a world which is visible, and the world was created by God, who is invisible. Now, there's no way to predict all the differences and how these variations might actually hit a reader. But it seems safe to assume that a sentence mentioning God 3 times and the world once will have a slightly different impact on a reader than a sentence that mentions the world 3 times and God twice. And there surely must be some difference between a sentence that simply assumes God exists and one that chooses to make that claim explicitly. But let's leave the theologically complicated territory of this particular sentence to see how E.B. White approached the same phenomenon in his afterword to William Strunk's Elements of Style. White suggests to his readers, quote, "If you doubt that style is something of a mystery, try rewriting a familiar sentence and see what happens." The sentence he chooses is Thomas Paine's famous, "These are the times that try men's souls." And the variations he considers are, "Times like these try men's souls." Or, "How trying it is to live in these times." Or, "These are trying times for men's souls." And my favorite, "Soul-wise, these are trying times." White dryly concludes, quote, "It seems unlikely that Thomas Paine could have made his sentiment stick if he had couched it in any of these forms," end quote. Or to consider these variations in the terms we've been developing in this lecture, while each different form of Thomas Paine's celebrated sentence seems to advance the same underlying propositions, and all could be summarized in pretty much the same way, each sentence hits us differently, and only Paine's version has the power that makes it appeal to our ears and stick in our minds. Now let's take one step further, the idea that a written sentence is the surface expression of one or more underlying and unwritten propositions. Let's see how the order in which those underlying propositions are advanced by the written sentence can make a big difference in the way the sentence works. This is an important step for writers to take because once it becomes clear that the order in which propositions appear in a sentence directly affects the way the sentence works, writers can take conscious control of that order to better accomplish their purpose for the sentence. Consider this sentence. He drove the car carefully, his shaggy hair whipped by the wind, his eyes hidden behind wraparound mirror shades, his mouth set in a grim smile, a .38 police special on the seat beside him, the corpse stuffed in the trunk. I think most of us would agree that the punch of this sentence comes at the end, and that the most significant proposition it advances is that there's a corpse in the trunk. But that's only one of the propositions the sentence advances. Those propositions, in the order in which they appear, are: he drove the car, he drove carefully, he had shaggy hair, the wind whipped his shaggy hair, his eyes were hidden, wraparound mirror shades hid them, his mouth was set in a smile, the smile was grim, There was a 38 police special. It was on the seat by him. And finally, there was a corpse in the trunk. Now, we could argue about whether he drove the car carefully should count as one proposition or as two, or whether a grim smile suggests one proposition or two, or whether the detail that the corpse in the trunk had been stuffed there should add another proposition. But these distinctions don't really matter and shouldn't bother us. The point is that this sentence rests on a bunch of propositions, one of which seems considerably more significant and certainly is more dramatic than are the others. That such a more dramatic proposition is not revealed until the very end of the sentence builds suspense and might almost be thought of as a surprise ending. If we look at the surface of the sentence, we see that it reveals or unfolds its underlying propositions, however many we choose to count, through 6 distinct steps or chunks or discrete sequences of words. One clause, he drove the car carefully, followed by 5 modifying phrases. He drove the car carefully, there's the base clause, his shaggy hair whipped by the wind, a modifying phrase, his eyes hidden behind wraparound mirror shades, another modifying phrase, his mouth set in a grim smile, a 38 police special on the seat beside him, the corpse stuffed in the trunk. The clause, he drove the car carefully, contains a subject, he, and a verb, drove, and could stand alone as a sentence. Each modifying phrase contains or suggests a verb form, but not an active verb. And none of the modifying phrases can stand by itself as a sentence, even though each represents one of the propositions underlying the sentence. And because these particular modifying phrases can be moved around and still make sense, and that's because all of them modify some aspect of the base clause, we call them free modifiers. Like Legos, free modifiers can be stuck together lots of different ways. For instance, our sentence might be rearranged by moving the base clause deeper, but keeping the modifying phrases in their original order. His shaggy hair whipped by the wind, he drove the car carefully, his eyes hidden behind wraparound mirror shades, his mouth set in a grim smile, a 38 police special on the seat beside him, the corpse stuffed in the trunk. Or we can move it deeper still. His shaggy hair whipped by the wind, his eyes hidden behind wraparound mirror shades, he drove the car carefully. His mouth set in a grim smile, a 38 police special on the seat beside him, the corpse stuffed in the trunk. And so on, moving the base clause step by step deeper into the sentence until we finally get to his shaggy hair whipped by the wind, his eyes hidden behind wraparound mirror shades, his mouth set in a grim smile, a 38 police special on the seat beside him, the corpse stuffed in the trunk, he drove the car carefully. Or we might switch around the order of the modifying phrases. He drove the car carefully, his eyes hidden behind wraparound mirror shades, his shaggy hair whipped by the wind, his mouth set in a grim smile, a 38 police special on the seat beside him, the corpse stuffed in the trunk. Or, he drove the car carefully, the corpse stuffed in the trunk, a 38 police special on the seat beside him, his shaggy hair whipped by the wind, his eyes hidden behind wraparound mirror shades, his mouth set in a grim smile, and so on. In fact, if I remember the formula for possible combinations of items correctly, and if we think of this base clause plus 5 modifying phrases as consisting of 6 items, we could write 6 factorial or 720 variations on this sentence, representing 720 different orders in which we might arrange its propositions. But let's not try that. While everything I know about prose style tells me that each of those ever so slightly different word orders would ever so slightly change the emphasis and the impact of the sentence, I think I can make the point I hope to make with just 2 variations. The first is the sentence we started with. He drove the car carefully, his shaggy hair whipped by the wind, his eyes hidden behind wraparound mirror shades, his mouth set in a grim smile, a 38 police special on the seat beside him, the corpse stuffed in the trunk. Now, the second would invert the order of the sentence, placing the final modifying phrase first and putting the base clause last. The corpse stuffed in the trunk, a 38 police special on the seat beside him, his mouth set in a grim smile, his eyes hidden behind wraparound mirror shades, his shaggy hair whipped by the wind. He drove the car carefully. No doubt it's a matter of personal taste, but I enjoy or appreciate that first sentence where the corpse in the trunk comes as a complete surprise a lot more than I enjoy or appreciate the second one, where the first thing we learn is that there is a corpse in the trunk, and the last thing we learn is that someone drove carefully. Indeed, I don't think my preference is idiosyncratic, since even Professor Strunk suggests, quote, the proper place in the sentence for the word or group of words that the writer desires to make most prominent is usually the end, end quote. Put in the context of whatever sentences might precede our corpse in the trunk sentence and whatever sentences might follow it, that second version might actually be more appropriate. But I somehow doubt that it would ever be more effective. When a sentence works like a mini-narrative telling a kind of story that has a surprise ending, I think it will almost always catch a reader's attention and remind the reader of the creative mind that crafted that sentence. And that's one of the functions of style, to remind us of the mind behind the sentences we read. The point I think most important here is not that the end of the sentence is where we should place the word or words we most want to emphasize, but that the power of underlying propositions is not tied to the traditional ways we look at sentences. Most of us have been taught that the base clause of a sentence, the sentence's subject and predicate, is responsible for advancing its most important proposition, and this is simply not the case. Propositions carry emotional or affective impact that have nothing to do with the grammatical expression or surface structure that advances that proposition in a sentence. And only when we consider the emotional affect of the way we order and combine the propositions that underlie the sentences we speak or write, only then can we consider ourselves in control of our writing. Or to locate this phenomenon in the terminology I discussed in the last lecture, the way we give voice to the propositions that underlie the tip of the iceberg we see as a sentence has to do with the sentence's rhetorical functioning much more than with its grammatical description. Perhaps an example from Joseph Conrad's The Secret Sharer can suggest the way underlying propositions may actually carry more weight or have a greater impact on the reception of a sentence than does its surface. In an article, Literature as Sentences, published in College English in 1966, Richard Oman chose the noteworthy final sentence from Conrad's celebrated story to make the case that apprehension of a literary work begins with sentences, that sentence structures have a good deal to do with our experience of a literary work, and, roughly following Chomsky's lead, that, quote, most sentences directly and obliquely put more linguistic apparatus into operation than is readily apparent, end of quote. Oman illustrates his argument with the striking final sentence of The Secret Sharer. Walking to the taffrail, I was in time to make out on the very edge of a darkness thrown by a towering black mass like the very gateway of Erebus. Yes, I was in time to catch an evanescent glimpse of my white hat left behind to mark the spot where the secret sharer of my cabin and of my thoughts, as though he were my second self, had lowered himself into the water to take his punishment, a free man, a proud swimmer, striking out for a new destiny. We can almost hear the music swell as Conrad's narrator marks the departure of Leggett, whom the narrator has helped escape formal trial for a murder at sea, having decided that Leggett's action was justified by an extreme set of circumstances, an early brief for situational ethics. Oman sees in this sentence a just representation of its author's mind, quote, energetically stretching to subdue a dazzling experience outside the self, End of quote. Oman then notes that the base clause of this sentence, I was in time, which is repeated, is expanded by the embedded or supporting propositions, I walked to the taffrail, I made out, and I caught, ostensibly focusing our attention on the narrator, who is the subject of those 5 clauses. Not so fast, says Oman, who calls our attention to the fact that no less than 7 of the embedded sentences, underlying propositions, have sharer as grammatical subject. In another 3, the subject is a noun linked to sharer by the copula, a be verb. In 2, sharer is the direct object, and in 2 more, share is actually the verb. Thus, as Oman sees it, 13 propositions go to the semantic emphasis on the secret sharer, even though the surface of the sentence seems to emphasize the narrator's agency. In a fundamental way, Oman concludes, the sentence is mainly about Leggett, although the surface structure indicates otherwise. Yet the surface structure does not simply throw a false scent, Oman quickly notes, since its syntactic focus shifts from I in 7 underlying prepositions to hat, also the focus of 7 propositions, to finally arrive at sharer. Quote, this progression in the deep structure, Oman suggests, rather precisely mirrors both the rhetorical movement of the sentence from the narrator to Leggett via the hat that links them, and the thematic effect of the sentence, which is to transfer Leggett's experience to the narrator via the narrator's vicarious and actual experience in it. End of quote. Now, Oman never claims that this kind of propositional analysis is necessary for us to understand Conrad's style, nor do I want to claim that writers need to be this aware of the propositions underlying their sentences to give those sentences more effective shape. But it is a useful reminder that the surface structure of a sentence may rest on a large number of unwritten propositions, and that the style of a sentence includes the way it invokes, suggests, or assumes some of those propositions, as well as the way it explicitly represents others. Nor will we always agree on how those underlying propositions affect surface meaning. For example, I look at the same propositional unpacking that Oman offers for this sentence, and what I notice is that the narrator seems to want to hold on to the idea of the sharer as long as he can, as we frequently do with our most elaborate fantasies. When I teach this story, I focus on the clear evidence that our narrator has an active imagination, and get my students to at least consider how convenient Leggett is as a kind of imaginary friend at precisely the moment our narrator most needs one. And now, I think I'll start using Oman's analysis as another bit of evidence that might support such a reading. Mainly, I offer Oman's reading of this sentence to call attention one more time to the way written sentences represent the combination of underlying propositions, not all of which are directly apparent in the surface of the sentence. He refers to the propositional underpinning of this sentence as one of extraordinary density, and density is precisely one of the writing values I will argue for in this course. In the next lecture, we'll focus on the surprisingly few basic ways in which we can combine propositions in our writing to achieve greater density of the positive kind highlighted by Oman. One final note. The sentence about that corpse in the trunk I've discussed at such length, although remember I did spare you at least some of its 720 variations. It represents a kind of loose sentence we call cumulative. The cumulative sentence generally posits a brief base clause, he drove the car carefully, then follows it with free modifying phrases that really carry the sentence's most useful or most informative propositions. I like everything that a cumulative sentence does, from the way it allows us to add detail or information to a base clause, to the way its distinctive rhythm calls attention to the sentence as a thing in motion, making it particularly effective for capturing actions. It's no accident that sports writers and writers of hard-boiled detective stories use cumulative syntax for all that it's worth. I think cumulative syntax gives the writer an invaluable and multifaceted tool. For my money, cumulative syntax is the Swiss Army knife of sentence structure, and in subsequent lectures I'll attempt to show why I think that mastering cumulative syntax is the first and singly most important step we can take toward improving our writing.